May 28, 1914. The world was holding its breath. It had been exactly 2 years and 1 month since the Titanic disappeared beneath the North Atlantic. The psychological wound was still fresh. The world was terrified of the ocean. Every time a passenger stepped onto a gangplank, they looked for the lifeboats. They counted them. They asked about the watertight compartments. The shadow of the iceberg hung over every voyage. But in Quebec City, on the banks of the mighty St. Lawrence River, a ship was preparing to leave that promise to cure that fear. She was the RMS Empress of Ireland. She was not the biggest ship in the world, the Titanic dwarfed her. She was not the fastest, the Lusitania could leave her in the dust. But she was the pride of the Canadian Pacific Railway. She was known as the White Empress. And she had something the Titanic did not have. She had enough lifeboats for every single soul on board. She had a double hull, a steel skin within a steel skin, designed to survive the worst collisions. She had 24 watertight bulkheads, far more than the law required. The newspapers called her unsinkable, but this time the engineers believed it. She was a floating fortress of safety. As the sun began to set on that Thursday afternoon, the Empress sat at her berth, glowing in the late spring light. She was beautiful. 2 massive funnels, a sleek black hull, and decks polished to a mirror shine. 1,477 people were boarding. They walked up the gangplanks with light hearts. They were going home to England. They were going on vacation. They were going to business meetings. They looked at the calm waters of the St. Lawrence River and smiled. This wasn't the open Atlantic. There were no icebergs here. There were no rogue waves. It was just a river, a wide, gentle highway to the sea. They did not know that they were stepping into a tomb. They did not know that this ship, with all her safety features, with all her lifeboats, and all her double hulls, had less than 12 hours to live. The celebrity captain standing on the bridge, looking down at the bustling crowd, was a man who believed he was ready for anything. Captain Henry George Kendall. He was 39 years old, sharp, ambitious, a rising star in the British Merchant Navy. Henry Kendall was not just a sailor, he was a celebrity. 4 years earlier, in 1910, he had been the captain of another ship, the SS Montrose. On that voyage, he had noticed 2 suspicious passengers, a father and his son. Kendall had been reading the newspapers. He knew that Scotland Yard was hunting for a notorious murderer named Dr. Hawley Crippen, who had killed his wife, chopped her up, and buried her in his basement in London. Kendall watched the father and son closely. He noticed the son had hips that were too wide. He noticed they were holding hands. He realized the son was actually Crippen's mistress in disguise. Kendall did something no captain had ever done before. He used the newly invented wireless telegraph to send a message to London. Have strong suspicions that Crippen and friend are amongst saloon passengers. It was the first time in history that a criminal had been caught using radio technology. Scotland Yard sent a detective on a faster ship, and when Kendall arrived in Canada, he invited Dr. Crippen to his cabin for a drink. As Crippen raised his glass, the detective walked in and handcuffed him. Overnight, Captain Kendall became a hero. The press loved him. He was the Sherlock Holmes of the sea. He was the modern captain, observant, tech-savvy, and decisive. Now, for years later, he had been given command of the Empress of Ireland. This was a promotion. This was the big leagues. But there was a small detail that the newspapers didn't mention. Captain Kendall had never navigated the Empress down the St. Lawrence River before. He had commanded other ships, yes. But this ship, with her specific handling, her specific weight, and her specific turning circle, was new to him. He was confident, perhaps too confident. He stood on the bridge, adjusting his cap, checking his pocket watch. He looked at the sky. It was clear. Visibility was perfect. He turned to his first officer. "A fine night for a crossing," he said. He had no idea that he was about to face a test that no amount of cleverness could solve. The omen while Captain Kendall was feeling confident on the bridge, down on the pier, the crew was witnessing something that made their blood run cold. Sailors are a superstitious bunch. They believe in signs. They believe in omens. And the Empress of Ireland had a mascot. Her name was Emmy. Emmy was a tabby cat. She was a fixture on the ship. She had her own bed in the galley. She was loved by the cooks, the stewards, and the deckhands. She was a seasoned traveler. She had crossed the Atlantic dozens of times. She never missed a voyage. But on the afternoon of May 28th, Emmy was acting strange. As the crew began to load the final provisions, Emmy began to pace nervously on the deck. Her tail was twitching. She was meowing low and deep in her throat. Suddenly, she bolted. She ran down the gangplank, dodging the passengers, and leaped onto the wooden pier. One of the stewards laughed. He went down to retrieve her. "Come on, old girl," he said. "We're leaving." But Emmy hissed at him. She arched her back. Her fur stood on end. She refused to let him touch her. The steward tried again. He tried to pick her up. Emmy scratched him, drawing blood, and scrambled away to the top of a pile of cargo crates. She sat there, staring at the ship with wide, unblinking eyes. The steward went back on board, rubbing his scratched hand. He told the others, "The cat won't come back. She's abandoned ship." A murmur went through the crew mess. "A rat leaves a sinking ship," one old sailor whispered. "But a cat? A cat leaves a doomed ship." They tried to laugh it off. They told themselves it was just an animal. But as the final whistle blew, and the gangplanks were raised, many of the crew looked back at the pier. There sat Emmy, a small, lonely figure in the twilight, watching the Empress drift away from the land she would never touch again. It was the first crack in the armor of the Unsinkable ship. The mascot knew something the humans did not. The passengers, if the crew was nervous, the passengers were blissfully unaware. To them, the Empress of Ireland was a floating palace. In first class, the dining room was a spectacle of Edwardian elegance. Crystal chandeliers, mahogany paneling, and tables set with silver and fine china. Among the diners was Sir Henry Seton Karr. He was a famous British aristocrat, a big game hunter, and a politician. He was returning to England after a hunting trip in British Columbia. He sat at the captain's table, charming the ladies with stories of grizzly bears and wolves. He was a man who had faced death in the wild many times. He had his rifle stored in the hold. He felt safer here, in a tuxedo eating roast duck, than he ever did in the forest. He raised a glass of champagne. "To a swift journey," he said. Below them, in second class, the atmosphere was different, but just as joyous. The ship was carrying a massive delegation from the Salvation Army. 170 members of the Canadian staff band were on board. They were heading to London for an international congress. These were pious, gentle people. They had brought their instruments, trumpets, trombones, tubas. As the ship pulled away from Quebec City, they gathered on the promenade deck. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. The band leader raised his baton. And then, the sound of music drifted across the water. They didn't play a march. They played a hymn. "God be with you till we meet again. By his counsels guide. Uphold you. With his sheep securely fold you." The melody floated up to the bridge, where Captain Kendall was guiding the ship into the channel. It floated down to the steerage decks, where immigrants were unpacking their meager belongings. It was a beautiful, haunting moment. 170 voices singing about protection, about safety, about meeting again. They could not know that for most of them, this was their funeral song. Of the 170 Salvation Army members singing on that deck, only 26 would survive the night. The rest would take their instruments with them to the bottom of the river. Into the dark 4:30 p.m., the Empress picked up speed. She moved gracefully down the river, passing the green fields of Quebec. The passengers settled into their cabins. The stewards turned down the beds. The children were tucked in. It was a warm night for May. The portholes were open to let in the fresh river breeze. This was a critical detail. On the ocean, portholes were usually kept closed. But here, in the sheltered waters of the river, the rules were relaxed. Hundreds of portholes, just a few feet above the waterline, were left wide open. It seemed harmless. It was just fresh air. But those open portholes were hundreds of open wounds, waiting for the water to rush in. Captain Kendall steered the ship past the pilot station at Father Point. It was now 1:30 in the morning. May 29th. The pilot, the man who knew the river best, climbed down the rope ladder and got onto his little tugboat. He waved goodbye to the bridge. "Good luck, Captain," he shouted. Kendall waved back. "Good night." He was now in sole command. He turned the ship northeast, heading for the open Gulf of St. Lawrence. The river here was wide, nearly 30 miles across. It felt like the ocean, but the land was still there, lurking in the darkness. Kendall scanned the horizon with his binoculars. The night was clear. The stars were out. And then he saw it. 6 miles away, coming up the river, was the masthead light of another ship. It was the SS Storstad, a Norwegian collier, coal ship. She was ugly, black, and heavy. She was fully loaded with 10,000 tons of coal. Her bow was reinforced with steel for breaking ice. She was essentially a massive, floating sledgehammer. Kendall looked at the lights. He calculated the angle. "Green to green," he muttered. It was a standard passing maneuver. The two ships would pass each other on the starboard side. Plenty of room. No danger. Kendall relaxed. He ordered a slight course correction to give the other ship even more room. He didn't know that behind him the weather was changing. A low, white bank of fog was rolling off the shore. It was silent. It was fast. And it was deadly. It was moving across the water like a predator stalking its prey. In 10 minutes, it would swallow the Empress. In 20 minutes, the lights would vanish. In 30 minutes, the nightmare would begin. The stage was set. The players were in position. The celebrity captain, the cursed cat, the singing band, the coal ship, and the fog. The Empress of Ireland sailed on, her engines humming a low, steady rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. It was the heartbeat of a dying giant. 1:30 in the morning. May 29th. The St. Lawrence River was a sheet of black glass. On the bridge of the Empress of Ireland, it was quiet. The only sounds were the rhythmic thrum of the engines and the soft ticking of the brass chronometer. Captain Henry Kendall stood by the binnacle, his hands clasped behind his back. He was relaxed. He had just dropped off the pilot. He had navigated the tricky shallows. Now he was in deep water. He raised his binoculars and scanned the horizon. To the east, about 6 miles away, he saw a light. It was a single white masthead light. Then, a second light appeared below it. And then a green light. A green light meant starboard, the right side of a ship. Kendall knew exactly what he was looking at. It was the SS Storstad, the Norwegian coal collier that ran this route regularly. She was heading upriver, toward Montreal, heavy with 10,000 tons of coal. Kendall lowered his binoculars. He did the mental math instantly. The Storstad was off his starboard bow. If both ships held their course, they would pass each other safely, green to green, right side to right side. It was a standard maneuver. There was plenty of room, miles of open water between them. It was routine, boring even. Kendall turned to his first officer, Edward Jones. "We have a ship off the starboard bow," Kendall said calmly. "We shall give her plenty of room." He ordered a slight course correction to widen the gap. He wanted to be absolutely sure. He was a safe captain. He was a prudent captain. He watched the Storstad's lights for another few minutes. They were clear, sharp, unmistakable. And then nature played a cruel trick. The white wall, it didn't come from the sky. Came from the land. From the south bank of the river, a low, dense bank of fog began to roll across the water. It wasn't a mist. It was a wall. A physical barrier of white vapor, fueled by the temperature difference between the warm air and the freezing river water. Kendall watched it coming. He frowned. "Fog," he muttered. He didn't panic. Fog was common on the St. Lawrence. He knew the procedure. But this fog was different. It was moving with terrifying speed. 1 minute, the Storstad was clearly visible, her green light shining like an emerald in the dark. The next minute, the emerald vanished. The white wall swallowed the coal ship whole. Then it raced across the water and swallowed the Empress. The world disappeared. From the bridge wings, Kendall couldn't even see the bow of his own ship. The forecastle, where the lookouts were standing, was gone. The water was gone. The stars were gone. It was as if someone had wrapped the ship in thick, wet cotton wool. The visibility dropped from 6 miles to 0 in less than 60 seconds. Kendall's heart rate spiked. He was now blind. He was moving at 18 knots in a river with another ship somewhere close by. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it now. This is the moment where history holds its breath. This is the moment where Henry Kendall, the hero, the crime fighter, the celebrity captain, made the decision that would doom his ship. The fatal mistake. Kendall was a man of action. He didn't like uncertainty. He didn't like drifting. His instinct was to stop, to pause the game until he could see the board again. He grabbed the engine telegraph. He rang the bells. Clang clang, clang clang. He moved the handles from full ahead to full astern, full reverse. It was a bold move. He was ordering the massive propellers to spin backward, to act as brakes, to bring the 14,000-ton liner to a dead stop. The whole ship shuddered as the engines fought against the momentum. The passengers in their beds felt the vibration. The silverware in the dining room rattled. Slowly, the Empress lost her speed. She slowed to a crawl, and then she stopped. She was dead in the water. Kendall let out a breath. He felt safer now. He was stationary. According to the rules of the road, if you are stopped, you are not a threat. You are just an island. But Kendall had forgotten one crucial thing. A ship is not a car. Car has brakes and tires. When it stops, it stays put. A ship floats in a moving body of water. By stopping his engines, Kendall lost steerage way. The rudder only works when water is flowing over it. Without speed, the rudder is useless. You cannot turn. You cannot dodge. The Empress of Ireland was now a sitting duck. She was sitting in the current of the St. Lawrence River, which was flowing at 5 knots. Without engine power, the current grabbed the ship. It began to twist her. It began to drift her. Kendall thought he was standing still. But in reality, his ship was slowly swinging sideways, turning her broadside, her vulnerable belly, toward the invisible enemy. He had turned his ship into a wall that was blocking the highway. The misunderstood whistles now began the dance of death. A conversation spoken in screams. Kendall reached for the whistle cord. He pulled it 3 times. Hoo, hoo, hoo. 3 short blasts. In maritime language, this means, I am operating my engines full astern. I am reversing. I am stopping. He waited. He strained his ears against the silence of the fog. From the darkness, a reply came. Hoo. 1 long blast. 1 long blast means, I am keeping my course and speed. It was the Storstad. The Norwegian captain, Thomas Anderson, was telling Kendall, I am still coming. I am not turning. Kendall frowned. He checked his compass. He checked the wind. Where was that sound coming from? Fog does strange things to sound. It bends sound waves. It creates acoustic shadows. A whistle can sound like it's coming from the left when it's actually coming from the right. It can sound miles away when it is right on top of you. Kendall thought the Storstad was still off to his starboard, safely passing green to green. But Captain Anderson on the Storstad had seen something different before the fog fell. He thought the Empress was crossing his path. He thought they were passing red to red, port to port. So Anderson had turned his ship slightly to the right. Kendall had turned his ship slightly to the right. They were turning into each other. Kendall pulled the cord again. 3 blasts. I am stopped. I am reversing. The Storstad replied again. 1 long blast. I am coming. The tension on the bridge was suffocating. The officers stood frozen, staring into the white void. Their knuckles were white on the railings. Every second felt like an hour. Where is she? Kendall whispered. Where is she? He looked at the clock. 1:52 a.m. He had been stopped for about 8 minutes. He felt a sudden urge to move, to do something, to get out of the way. But which way? If he moved forward, he might hit her. If he moved backward, he might hit her. So he waited. He trusted the lights he had seen 20 minutes ago. He trusted his memory. He didn't know that his memory was a map of a world that no longer existed. The current had moved him. The Storstad had turned. The geometry of the collision was locked in. The revelation 1:55 a.m. The fog thinned for a split second. Just a tease. Kendall looked out the starboard window. His blood froze in his veins. He didn't see a light miles away. He saw two masthead lights, and a green light, and a red light. They were looming out of the mist, high above the water, terrifyingly close. A ship is never supposed to see both the red and green lights of another ship at the same time. That means she is heading straight for you. The Storstad was not passing. She was charging. She was less than 100 feet away. She was emerging from the fog like a phantom, her black bow cutting through the water, aimed directly at the center of the Empress. It was a collision course. Perfect T-bone. Kendall didn't scream. He didn't freeze. He reacted with the desperation of a man who sees the executioner's axe falling. He grabbed the megaphone. He ran to the wing of the bridge. He screamed into the fog, his voice cracking with terror. Full speed ahead. Put her hard as starboard. He was trying to swing his tail away. He was trying to make the Storstad glance off the stern. Then he lifted the megaphone toward the invisible ship. Go full astern, he screamed at the Norwegians. Full astern. But physics does not listen to screams. 10,000 tons of coal, moving at 10 knots, carries the momentum of a freight train. You cannot stop it in 100 feet. The Storstad kept coming. Silent, relentless, unstoppable. The officers on the Empress braced themselves. They grabbed the railings. Down below, the passengers were sleeping. The Salvation Army band members were dreaming of London. The children were clutching their teddy bears. They didn't hear the whistle. They didn't hear the shout. They only heard the crunch. It wasn't a loud bang. It was a sickening, metallic tearing sound, like a giant can opener ripping through tin. The Storstad didn't just hit the Empress. She drove into her. The steel bow of the collier sliced through the steel plates of the liner, cut through the double hull, cut through the coal bunkers. It smashed into the boiler rooms. The phantom in the fog had become a solid, deadly reality. And as the lights of the Storstad towered over the bridge of the Empress, Captain Kendall knew one thing with absolute certainty. His ship, the unsinkable White Empress, was mortally wounded, and he had nowhere to run. 1:55 a.m. The fog was still thick, swirling around the bridge of the Empress of Ireland like a shroud. Captain Henry Kendall was gripping the rail of the starboard wing, his knuckles white. He was leaning out as far as he dared, staring into the gray void. He knew something was out there. He could feel it, the displacement of the water, the smell of coal smoke mixing with the damp river air. And then the ghost materialized. It didn't look like a ship at first. It looked like a cliff face, a wall of black steel, towering 30 feet out of the water, emerging from the mist less than 100 feet away. It was the bow of the SS Storstad, and it was terrifying. The Storstad was not built for speed or beauty. She was a collier, a workhorse designed to carry massive loads of coal through the frozen waters of the North Atlantic. Because of this, her bow was reinforced with extra-thick steel plating. It was designed to smash through pack ice. It was essentially a giant, floating chisel. And right now, that chisel was moving at 10 knots, carrying the momentum of 11,000 tons of dead weight. Kendall screamed his order. Hard as starboard. He was trying to swing the Empress's stern away, trying to turn his ship parallel to the Storstad so the blow would be a glancing scrape rather than a direct hit. It was a good maneuver. It was the only maneuver. But he was 5 seconds too late. The impact, the collision didn't sound like an explosion. It sounded like a scream. The Storstad's ice-breaking bow slammed into the starboard side of the Empress, right amidships. It punched through the steel hull plating as if it were wet cardboard. The noise was sickening. The screech of metal shearing against metal, the popping of rivets like gunshots, and the deep, groaning shudder of the ship's frame absorbing the kinetic energy. The Storstad didn't just hit the Empress. She drove into her. The collier's bow penetrated 25 feet deep into the liner's side. It sliced through the outer skin. It sliced through the inner skin of the double hull. It smashed through the coal bunkers. And it stopped right between the two boiler rooms. The mess hall for the firemen was located exactly at the point of impact. The men sleeping there never woke up. They were crushed instantly in their bunks. For a moment, a frozen, surreal heartbeat, the two ships were locked together. They were dancing a grotesque waltz on the quiet river. The Storstad was embedded in the Empress, held fast by the twisted metal. Up on the bridge, Captain Kendall felt the ship lurch. He knew he had been hit, but he didn't know how bad it was. He looked down from the wing. He saw the black shape of the other ship sticking out of his vessel's flank. And in that split second, Henry Kendall's mind raced. He understood the physics of buoyancy better than anyone. He knew that as long as the Storstad stayed inside the hole, she was acting as a giant plug. She was blocking the water. She was keeping the wound closed. If she stayed there, the Empress might survive. Kendall grabbed his megaphone. He leaned over the side, shouting at the top of his lungs toward the bridge of the collier. "Keep her full ahead," he screamed. "Don't go backward. Keep her full ahead." He was begging the Norwegian captain to keep his engines running, to keep pushing against the Empress, to keep the plug in the dam. It was a desperate strategy. But it was the only chance they had. The withdrawal, but the laws of physics were working against Captain Kendall. The Empress of Ireland was still moving slightly forward, carried by her own momentum. The Storstad had struck her at an angle. The current of the St. Lawrence River, ripping past at 5 knots, grabbed the stern of the collier. The force of the current twisted the Storstad. It acted like a giant hand, wrenching the smaller ship sideways. Captain Anderson on the Storstad threw his engines into reverse, trying to save his own ship from being dragged under. And so the plug was pulled. With a terrible grinding noise, the Storstad wrenched herself free. She backed out of the wound she had created. She vanished back into the fog as quickly as she had appeared, leaving the Empress alone in the dark. And with her, she took the Empress's life. As the Storstad withdrew, she left behind a hole the size of a 2-car garage. It was 350 square feet of open space, stretching from the waterline down to the keel. The river didn't just leak in. It didn't trickle. It roared. 60,000 gallons of freezing water per second began to pour into the heart of the ship. To put that in perspective, imagine a swimming pool. Now imagine filling that entire pool in 1 second. That is how much water was entering the Empress. It was a water hammer, a solid wall of water crashing through the coal bunkers, smashing through the bulkheads, and flooding the boiler rooms. The firemen who had survived the impact were now facing a wall of water moving faster than a car. They scrambled up the ladders, screaming as the water chased them. Most didn't make it. The lights go out on the Titanic, the passengers had time. The Titanic hit the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. She didn't sink until 2:20 a.m. That's 2 hours and 40 minutes. During that time, the lights stayed on. The band played. The stewards served drinks. The engineers kept the dynamos running deep in the stern, keeping the ship bright and civilized until the very end. The Empress of Ireland did not have that luxury. The Empress was hit at 1:55 a.m. By 1:56 a.m., she was already listing, tilting, sharply to the starboard side. The water rushed straight into the dynamo room, where the electrical generators were spinning. Cold river water hit the hot generators. ZZZZT. There was a massive short circuit, a shower of sparks, and then silence. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the Empress of Ireland plunged into total, absolute darkness. It had been less than 3 minutes since the collision. Imagine the terror. You are a passenger in 3rd class, sleeping in a bunk deep inside the ship. You are woken up by a jolt. You hear a grinding noise. You sit up. It is pitch black. You can't see your hand in front of your face. And then you feel the floor tilting. It's not a gentle roll. It's a steep, sickening slide. Your suitcase slides across the floor and hits the wall. And then you hear it. The sound of rushing water. The sound of screams in the corridor. You try to find the door. But the ship is tilting so fast that the door is now on the ceiling. The wall is becoming the floor. You are trapped in a steel box, in the dark, with the river rising around your ankles. Up on the bridge, Captain Kendall realized he had lost all power. He tried to use the telegraph to signal the engine room. Dead. He tried to use the telephone to call the wireless room. Dead. He shouted for the Marconi operators, the wireless men. "Send the SOS!" he screamed. "Send it now!" The wireless operators, Edward Beamish and Ronald Ferguson, were heroes that night. They were working by the light of emergency oil lamps. The main power was gone, so they switched to the backup battery power. It was weak, but it worked. SOS. Empress of Ireland. We have been struck. Sinking fast. They tapped out the message frantically. The operator at the station at Father Point, just a few miles away, heard the faint, crackling signal. He sat up in his chair. "Good God!" he whispered. He tapped back. "Where are you?" But there was no reply. The battery on the Empress had died. The wireless room was already flooding. The ship was alone, blind, mute, and dying. Captain Kendall looked at the inclinometer, the instrument that measures the tilt of the ship. It read 15 degrees. A minute later, it read 20 degrees. Kendall grabbed the railing to stop himself from sliding across the bridge. He looked at his first officer. "She's going," Kendall said. His voice was flat, shocked. "She's going over." He didn't mean she was sinking by the bow like the Titanic. He meant she was rolling over, like a dying whale. The Empress wasn't just taking on water. She was losing her center of gravity. The water trapped on the starboard side was pulling her down, twisting her. It was 1:58 a.m. 3 minutes had passed. 11 minutes left. The death kiss had been delivered. Now the river was coming to collect the souls. 1:58 a.m. 3 minutes after the collision. The Empress of Ireland was dying. But she wasn't dying like the Titanic. The Titanic took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. She stayed relatively level for a long time. People had time to dress, to say goodbye, to pray, to smoke a cigarette. The band had time to play a concert. The Empress had none of that. She was not sinking. She was rolling. The water pouring into the starboard side was so heavy, thousands of tons per minute, that it was pulling the ship over onto her side like a wrestler pinning an opponent. And then, a small, innocent decision made by hundreds of passengers turned into a death sentence. The open portholes because the ship was in the St. Lawrence River and not the rough Atlantic Ocean. The captain had allowed the passengers to open their portholes. It was a warm night. The cabins were stuffy. People wanted fresh air. So hundreds of round glass windows, just a few feet above the waterline, were pushed open. When the ship began to list to the right, these open portholes dipped below the surface of the river. Suddenly, hundreds of new holes appeared in the ship's skin. It was a chain reaction. As the ship tilted 5 degrees, the lower deck portholes went under. Water poured in. This weight made the ship tilt 10 degrees. Then the main deck portholes went under. More water. 15 degrees. 20 degrees. The river wasn't just entering through the gash made by the storestad. It was entering through every open window on the starboard side. The ship was drinking the river. Passengers who were still asleep in their bunks woke up to a nightmare. Imagine waking up in the pitch dark. You hear a roaring sound. And then, freezing cold river water pours through your window, hitting you in the face with the force of a fire hose. You try to get to the door, but the water is rising so fast it pins the door shut. You are trapped in a steel box that is rapidly filling with water. Hundreds of people died this way. They drowned in their pajamas, in their own beds, before they even knew the ship was sinking. The fatal flaw, the longitudinal bulkheads, but why did she roll over so fast? The answer lies in a specific design flaw. A flaw that was supposed to be a safety feature. The Empress was built with longitudinal bulkheads. These are watertight walls that run lengthwise down the center of the ship, from bow to stern. The idea was that if one side of the ship got flooded, the water would be trapped on that side, keeping the engines and boilers on the other side dry. It sounds logical on paper, but in reality it was a death trap. When the water rushed into the starboard side, the longitudinal bulkheads did their job too well. They trapped the water on the right side. They prevented it from flowing evenly across the ship to the left side. So, instead of the ship settling down evenly, like the Titanic, all the weight was concentrated on one side. It acted like a giant lever. The weight of the water on the starboard side pulled the ship over with terrifying speed. Within 10 minutes, the list was so severe, over 30 degrees, that it became impossible to stand up. The human crush 2:05 a.m. 10 minutes after impact. The Empress was now listing at 60 degrees. Try to imagine a 60-degree angle. The floor is no longer a floor. It is a steep, slippery slide. The wall is no longer a wall. It is the floor. The ceiling is the wall. Inside the ship, the world had turned sideways. Passengers who had managed to get out of their cabins found themselves in a funhouse from hell. The corridors were tilted. To get to the starboard side, the lower side, you slid down uncontrollably into the water. To get to the port side, the high side, you had to climb the floor like a mountain. But the floor was polished linoleum. It was wet. It was slick with oil. People were crawling on their hands and knees, clawing at the carpets, trying to pull themselves up toward the high side of the ship. And then the furniture began to move. Pianos in the music room broke loose from their bolts. Heavy oak tables in the dining room slid across the floor. Suitcases, chairs, statues, they became missiles in the dark. Survivors described the sound of heavy objects crashing through the wooden partitions, crushing anyone in their path. A grand piano slid across the lounge and smashed through a wall, killing a group of women who were trying to climb the stairs. The stairs themselves became deadly traps. In a normal ship, stairs go up and down. In a ship listing at 60 degrees, the stairs are tilted sideways. If you slip, you don't fall down the stairs. You fall off the stairs, dropping 20 or 30 feet into the stairwell shaft below. It was chaos. Absolute, screaming chaos. And it was dark. The lights were gone. The only illumination came from the few emergency flares that crew members had managed to light on the deck. The boat deck up on the boat deck. The situation was hopeless. The Empress carried enough lifeboats for everyone. But because of the severe list, they were useless. The boats on the port side, the high side, were swinging inward, over the deck. They couldn't be lowered because they would just drag against the side of the ship. The boats on the starboard side, the low side, were swinging out too far. And as the ship rolled over, they were getting too close to the water. Crew members tried desperately to cut the ropes. They managed to launch only a handful of boats. 5 or 6 boats. That was it. Out of 40 boats. Most of the passengers who made it to the deck didn't get into a lifeboat. They just slid. They slid down the sloping deck and into the freezing river. The water was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to stop your heart in minutes. The final plunge 2:09 a.m., 14 minutes after the collision. The Empress of Ireland gave up the fight. She rolled completely onto her starboard side. Her funnels hit the water with a massive splash. For a few moments, the ship lay flat on the water, like a sleeping giant. The port side of the hull was now horizontal, sticking out of the river like a steel island. Hundreds of passengers were standing on the hull. They were walking on the side of the ship, which was now dry land. They thought they were safe for a moment. But then the stern began to rise. Captain Kendall was still on the bridge. He had stayed until the end. As the ship lurched, he was thrown from the wing. He fell into the dark water. He surfaced, gasping for air. He looked back at his command. He saw the lights of the Storstad in the distance, a ghostly shape in the fog. And he saw his beautiful Empress sliding away. The air inside the ship began to escape. Survivors described a sound like a terrible sigh, a massive exhale of air as the water forced its way into the last dry pockets. The bow dipped. The stern rose high into the air, silhouetted against the stars. And then she slipped under. It was smooth. It was quiet. It was terrifyingly fast. One moment there was a 700-foot ocean liner. The next moment there was nothing, just a swirl of bubbles, a slick of oil, and the cries of hundreds of people struggling in the freezing black water. 1,012 people were gone. More passengers died on the Empress of Ireland than on the Titanic. And it had all happened in the time it takes to boil an egg. 14 minutes. From a floating palace to a steel coffin at the bottom of the St. Lawrence River. The unsinkable ship had vanished. As Captain Kendall treaded water, clinging to a piece of wooden grating, he must have realized the horror of his situation. He was the man who had caught a murderer with a radio. He was the hero. Now, he was the captain who had just lost more souls in 14 minutes than any other captain in Canadian history. And the silence that followed was heavier than the fog. May 29th, 1914. Dawn. The sun rose over the St. Lawrence River. The fog had vanished. The water was calm and blue. To a casual observer standing on the shore, the river looked exactly the same as it had the day before. But underneath the surface, 130 feet down, lay a steel tomb. The Empress of Ireland was gone. Of the 1,477 people on board, only 465 survived. 1,012 people were dead. More passengers had died than on the Titanic. The survivors were picked up by the Storstad, the very ship that had sunk them, and by another steamer, the Lady Evelyn. They were brought back to Quebec City. Captain Henry Kendall was among them. He was shivering, wrapped in a blanket, his uniform soaked. He had survived. But as he stepped onto the dock, he saw the flashbulbs of the press. He saw the angry faces of the families. The hero of the Dr. Crippen case was gone. Now he was the villain of the St. Lawrence. The courtroom drama, the inquiry, began just 2 weeks later. In June 1914, the location was the King's Bench Courthouse in Quebec City. The man presiding over the inquiry was Lord Mersey. He was a legendary British judge. He was the same man who had overseen the inquiry into the sinking of the Titanic 2 years earlier. He must have felt a sense of déjà vu. Another unsinkable ship. Another captain. Another tragedy. But this trial was different. In the Titanic case, the enemy was an iceberg. Icebergs don't hire lawyers. Here there were 2 captains, 2 ships, 2 stories. It became a vicious legal battle. On one side was Captain Kendall and the Canadian Pacific Railway. They had the best lawyers money could buy. Their story was simple. We stopped in the fog. We were motionless. The Storstad changed course and rammed us. On the other side was Captain Anderson and the Norwegians. They were rougher, simpler men. But they were stubborn. Their story was the opposite. We kept our course. The Empress was moving. She cut across our bow. The courtroom was packed. Survivors testified about the open portholes. They testified about the failure of the watertight doors. They testified about the chaos on the slanting deck. But the central question remained. Who turned? Lord Mersey listened. He looked at the charts. He looked at the damage on the Storstad's bow. The damage was crucial. The metal was twisted in a specific way that suggested the Empress was moving forward when she was hit. This contradicted Kendall's claim that he was dead stopped. However, the angle of impact proved that the Storstad had indeed changed her course to starboard. The verdict after 11 days of testimony. Lord Mersey delivered his verdict. It was a masterpiece of legal diplomacy, but it destroyed 2 careers. The court ruled that the primary blame lay with the Storstad. Captain Anderson was found at fault for altering his course in the fog without knowing where the other ship was. He had turned his ship blindly. But Captain Kendall did not escape. Lord Mersey criticized him heavily. He ruled that Kendall's decision to stop his engines was a fatal error. By stopping, he had lost the ability to steer. He had made his ship a sitting duck. If Kendall had kept going, even slowly, he might have crossed the Storstad's path safely. It was a shared failure, a tragedy caused by 2 men trying to be safe, but ultimately blinding each other. Captain Kendall never commanded a passenger liner again. He served in the First World War, survived a torpedo attack, ironically, and lived quietly in England until his death in 1965. He rarely spoke of the Empress. but it is said that he never forgave himself for the 14 minutes that defined his life. The divers, while the lawyers argued in Quebec, a darker task was happening on the river. The Empress was lying in shallow water, only 130 feet deep. This meant she was accessible. The Canadian Pacific Railway hired a team of hard-hat divers to go down. Their job was grim: retrieve the silver, the gold, the mail, and the bodies. The divers described a scene from a nightmare. The ship was lying on her starboard side. The mud of the riverbed had swallowed her up to the promenade deck. Because the pressure wasn't crushing, unlike the Titanic at 12,000 feet, the ship was largely intact. Divers swam through the corridors. They floated into the dining room. They saw tables still set for breakfast. They saw suitcases drifting in the current. And they saw the dead. Because the sinking happened so fast, hundreds of bodies were trapped inside. One diver described finding a mother and child hugging each other in a cabin, perfectly preserved by the cold, dark water. Another described floating into the purser's office to retrieve the safe. He had to push aside obstacles floating in the water. Those obstacles were passengers. Over the summer of 1914, they recovered hundreds of bodies. But hundreds more were never found. They remain inside the wreck to this day. In later years, the wreck became a target for looters. Unscrupulous divers went down to steal portholes, bells, and artifacts. The Empress was stripped. She was dynamited. She was disrespected. It wasn't until 1999 that the site was finally protected as a historical monument. Today it is a grave. You can go there, but you cannot touch. Why we forgot the sinking of the Empress of Ireland was front-page news around the world. For a few weeks, the world mourned. The Salvation Army held massive funerals. The newspapers ran editorials about fog signals and watertight doors. It seemed like a tragedy that would never be forgotten. But history is cruel. The date was May 29, 1914. Exactly 1 month later, on June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped up to a car in Sarajevo. He fired 2 shots. He killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The dominoes began to fall. Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized. Germany invaded Belgium. England declared war. By August, the world was engulfed in the flames of the First World War. The death of 1,000 people on a river in Canada suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the death of millions in the trenches of France. The newspapers stopped writing about the Empress. They started writing about the Somme, Verdun, and Ypres. Captain Kendall, the man who lost his ship, went to fight U-boats. The survivors went to work in munitions factories. The Empress of Ireland was erased from the collective memory. The Titanic is remembered because she represented the end of an era, the Gilded Age. She was the hubris of man before the fall. The Empress is forgotten because she was the opening act of the apocalypse. She was the last tragedy of the old world, buried by the horrors of the new one. But if you go to the St. Lawrence River today, near the town of Rimouski, you can look out at the water. There is a buoy there, a simple marker. Beneath that buoy lies the bones of a great ship. And inside her, hidden in the silt, are the skeletons of the Salvation Army band, still holding their instruments, waiting to play one last hymn. God be with you till we meet again. It was the ship that vanished in 14 minutes. The ship that proved that even the unsinkable can be destroyed by a simple mistake. And it remains, to this day, the most tragic ghost story of the sea.